Good morning, welcome. And before we make the bracha, I just want to mention that I've posted the sessions that we did last year on Toldot on my YouTube page. It's there now, and if you want to see what the sequence is at this point, I'll try and retitle them so that it says part one, part two, etc. But right now, if you look at the date, that's the number next to it, you'll see the date, and of course you can then do it in sequence according to the date if you want to check out, because what I'd like to do is then proceed into the parsha today. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And here we go. So we've talked about last year. We did a little bit about the difficulties that Isaac and Rebecca had in conceiving, and then I believe it's something like 10 years or more that they had to wait before they finally were able to conceive. And of course they had twins, and these twins turned out to be quite different from each other. Both in looks and very much in personality. And of course, that's basically what we're going to deal with at this point of the Parsha, is this distinction between Esau and Jacob, and this great rivalry that's a great theme, a leitmotif in terms of Jewish history in general. So again, this binary nature of things. So here we go.
How old was Isaac?
So I believe he was 40 when he married Rebecca, and maybe he was 60 when they were born. I'd have to go back and check. Sadly, my memory isn't sharp enough to remember the details. I'd have to go back. I can. It's not that far to go back.
I think you're right that they came 20 years after the marriage.
Yeah.
That was what was the figure that was mentioned in last night's teaching.
Oh, really? Okay, super. Let's see.
How old was Rebecca then?
Well, that's a good question, and there's some discussion about that as to how old she was. There's some theories that she was extremely young, but there's also last year we discussed this. There's a way of figuring it out so that she wasn't quite so young. She wasn't like 4 years old or something like that. Okay, let's see if I can find it. Thanks, Lauren. I appreciate that you're mentioning that shiur. Let's see. Here we go. Isaac was 40 when he married Rebecca. Vayitzchak ben shishim shana. He was 60 years. Beledet otam, I believe, is what the rest of that. Yeah, beledet otam. Right there. Okay. So 20 years they waited to conceive. All right. So again, this distinction, this is what the Torah is doing now, is just, lining out all these distinctions and comparisons of these twins. And I think there's a huge irony, right? That they are twins. They're twins. And yet there's this rivalry between them. A rivalry even unto death. And I'm wondering if that has to do with some deep message regarding whether or not how do we get along. We're all created in the image of God, and how do we do it? And need to understand that somewhere along the line we're still twins, right? We're related. Anyway, ve'yehav Yitzchak et Esau ki tzayid befiv, and Isaac loved Esau, and this is ki tzayid befiv, for there was game in his mouth. I'll just continue the verse, but we're going to have to look at this carefully because it's ambiguous. Ve'rivka ohevet et Yaakov, while Rivka, and it's interesting that the tense of this verb is different from the tense of ye'ehav, right? This has to do maybe, the implication of completeness, something like that. But I think it's very significant, even though we're not going to necessarily analyze this particular grammatical issue. But ohevet is like a continuous action, right? It's imperfect in the sense that it's continuous, whereas ve'ye'ehav is sort of more of a completed action. So how one understands that completeness and that continuous, but that's the best I can do right now in terms of trying to explain this interesting distinction, right? Because it could have said V'yehav Yitzchak et Esav, etc. V'te'ehav Rivka et Yaakov, right? Just putting into the feminine, but it doesn't. At any rate, what Rashi is going to look at is Ki tzayit pifiv.
Rabbi?
Right? Yes.
Could you tell me what chapter you're on?
Yes, of course. Chapter 25, it looks like, and verse 28.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Why does Isaac favor Esau?
That's exactly what we're going to look at right now. We're going to exactly examine that because it's so peculiar. Here we have this great tzaddik, and he's loving someone who is going to be, within our tradition, understood as a rasha, and I suspect even from the Torah. But it's a lot more subtle, and there's a reason for it too. But anyway, befiv, ketargumo, bepiv shel Yitzchak. In other words, piv means his mouth, right? And whose mouth are we talking about? It's not conclusive. And not only that, Esau is the closer noun to piv, right? So we're going to play with that. So the Targum simply says, that the reason why Isaac loved Esau, remember he was a hunter, which meant he'd bring back game, and in this sense, and sayed here means game, right? Because there was game in his mouth. In other words, there was taste. I've seen a translation that said, because he had a taste for game. In other words, and this is brought out later on, right? I mean, we see how Isaac asks Esau to go and get him stuff, bring back.
But maybe Isaac was thinking about his youth, and he never was able to hunt or anything, do like Esau. And he said, "Boy, he's a man. I wish I was like him too when I was young."
I appreciate your playing around with it. Maybe, I don't know. You'd want to find a little bit more support for that, but certainly an interesting speculation. Anyway, that's one introduction. But if piv is his mouth, right? If piv refers to Esau's mouth, for Esau hunted him with his mouth. And Rashi's going to explain that, right? Let's keep going. Umidrasho. However, you can drash it. It's not the simple meaning of the text, but you can look at it, right, as a midrash. Befiv shel Esav, that we're talking about Esau's mouth. Shahayat sad oto, that he would, in a sense, he would hunt him. Umeramehu bidvarav, and he would lie to him. He would cheat him with his words. In other words, and that really is the whole issue of Esau, is that he shows one side of himself, and yet nevertheless, underneath it all, there's a lot of wickedness. He's like the Uriah Heep of the Torah. Okay? I mean, and this comes out later on, I think, within the narrative itself. In other words, that Esau tricked his father into thinking he was such a tzaddik. That's the midrash. That's a midrash, okay? Yeah. Did you want to say something?
No, I just was wondering why Esau was favored by Jacob so much.
By Isaac.
I mean, Isaac.
Yeah.
I just can't understand it. I mean,
so
why Jacob loved either by
Rebecca.
Yeah.
No, Rebecca, because I think the answer is that Rebecca really understood what Jacob was about. Okay.
In what way? In what way?
Well, it could be, and I don't want to speculate too much, but remember, we have another example of a big cheat. And who's that other example? Rebecca's brother, Laban. He's the other cheat. And maybe she understood because she'd had experience, whereas Isaac was naive when it came to that because he'd never experienced being cheated so much.
Oh.
So, and the other piece too is that, there's a little bit of maybe the fact that Rebecca came from that background as to why Esau was that way. But regardless, we have to take responsibility ultimately for our personalities and how we choose to develop them. At any rate, moving on to this extremely famous story. Vayazed Yaakov Nazid. Jacob was stewing a stew, right? He was making some soup. Vayavo Esav min hasadeh, and Esau came from the field, Vahu ayef, and he was tired, right? Exhausted. He was exhausted. Let's take a look at Rashi here. Vayazid. So this word vayazid, or lahazid, right? Lashon bishul. What it refers to is cooking, right? It means cooking. Ketargumor, and Rashi, of course, is referring now to the Targum, right? Here we go. Uvashil Yaakov tavshila. That's the Aramaic, right? So it's very clear in the Targum that Jacob was cooking some kind of stew or some kind of cooked food. Sometimes it's translated as pottage. Pottage is an archaic word, and it something you cook in a pot. And I looked up pottage in English, and it's an archaism of stew or soup. Okay, and the truth is, we're going to see he was making lentil soup. That's what he was making, and there's a lot of significance to that detail, and you'll see what comes out of this. We really are going to deconstruct this. Okay, Vahu, referring to this, ayef, right? Vahu ayef, and he was exhausted. Esau was exhausted, and now taking the midrash Bereshit Rabbah, right? Beritzicha, he was exhausted from murder, from committing murder. Kama de tema, as is stated. Why do we know this? There's a sort of an association with this word ayef. In Jeremiah chapter 4, it says, ayefa nafshi lahorgim. For my soul is wearied, exhausted from the murderers. So we have this connection of ayef, this suggestion, and that's what it is, right? It's not a pshat explanation, but it's definitely it's an allusion. And when we get to, if we have a chance to do Torah Tamima, whether it's today or tomorrow, he comments on these kinds of things. So this is
are they talking about Esau killing animals?
No.
Murder?
No, murdering a person. Well, we'll go into that detail, God willing, into that. But the point is, we are certainly moving along in terms of the distinction and contrast between Jacob and Esau. But what's interesting, of course, and what I think is beautiful about the nature of this narrative and its subtlety, is that Jacob is hardly an unblemished character himself, and he is going to have to face the consequences of it. At any rate, Vayomer Esav el Yaakov, Esau said to Jacob, Hal iteni na min ha'adom hazeh. So hal iteni, right, is it's a word that's usually used with regards to animals, and it describes a process of feeding an animal a measured amount of fodder at a time. But essentially, it's opening up the animal's throat and feeding the animal. And that's, so I translated it as gulp, let me gulp down from this red stuff. So whatever it was, right, that Jacob was cooking was red. And generally speaking, I think we understand that if we're talking about a red soup, guess what we're talking about? We're talking about lentils. And it may even say it somewhere explicitly. Okay? Ki ayef anochi, for I am exhausted. In other words, I don't even want to take the trouble of putting, getting the soup and lifting up the cup or the bowl or the spoon and putting, you need to, this is the halitani, right? You need to pour it down my throat. Al kain karash mo Edom. And he was called Edom because of this red soup that he was referring to. But he also, of course, had this red hairy mantle as well, as I recollect. So, but the redness, red has a connotation to it. That color has a connotation to it, right? Which is war and violence and things like that. Okay. Onwards. Hal itani, Rashi. Eftach pi, I will open my mouth, ushfoch harbe letocha, and pour a lot into it. Kamoshe shaninu, and as we learned, this is from a Mishnah, ein ofsin et hagamal, you don't, I looked up the translation of this, right? So apparently it says, you don't stuff the camel, aval mal itinoto, but you actually give it a little bit at a time. That's as that Mishnah is understood. Okay. So
I think that Esau didn't do a little at a time. He drank the whole thing.
Well, that's what he was asking for. He's asking for. So min hadom, from this red stuff. So Rashi says, adashim adumot, and he explains we're talking about red lentils, because we also know they're brown lentils, but these were red lentils. And now we again deconstruct further. V'oto hayom, and that very day, mate Abraham died. Shelo yir'eh et Esau ben Benor, that he should not see, that Abraham should not see Esau, his grandson, yotzeh letarbut ra'ah, engaging in bad behavior, going out to become, Go ahead.
It uses the word son of his son rather than the word for grandson.
Right.
Is that deliberate to distance him further, or
I see what you're saying.
I mean, is the word like neged or something?
Neched. No, it's a good point. He doesn't say nechdo. It says the son of his son. Yeah, literally son of his son. And that may be. It may be. I mean, the fact is, of course, it does mean grandson. But saying son of his son may have more to do with the fact that we know that one of the things that Abraham wanted more than anything else was to have a son to be able to continue the understanding that Abraham had and the worship of God, right? The understanding of the fact that there was a supreme and unique and ultimate power in this universe, or even outside the universe, that made the universe possible, transcendent power, and of course Esau was just acting in the opposite way. And we understand that our behavior, the way we behave morally, right, is all dependent. That's why you hear me keep saying, we're all created in God's image, all of us. And despite the fact that the Torah definitely makes distinctions here, nevertheless we have to keep that and bear that in mind as to how we judge and how we react. Ve'ein zo seva todah. So why was this happening? Why was Abraham dying that day? And this was why he died. Okay, this is not considered. If he had lived beyond this and watched Esau go into this degenerate behavior, it would have given Abraham a lot of pain. I mean, I don't think we have to speculate about that. And you can't call that ripe old age. He would be aggravated. And so to spare Abraham the aggravation, okay, God saw that he passed away. Actually, it turns out they suggest elsewhere 5 years earlier, because Isaac lives to 180 and Abraham to 175.
But has he already that here?
Say that again?
They suggest it here.
Okay, there we go. Right, that's true. Right next in the Rashi itself.
Hasn't he already engaged though in that bad behavior? I mean, or is this the first time? I mean, the implication sounds well. Anyway,
okay, no, okay. Okay, we're dealing with midrash here, but there is a midrash that talks about this, that it says when he came from the field, that this was the first time he'd actually engaged in this degree of degeneracy.
Murder, yeah, murdering a human being is that's
right.
That's pretty,
serious. Yes.
Yeah.
The other piece also, but let me keep going because Rashi does mention this here. Shehiftichu HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God had promised Abraham this. We read this explicitly back earlier. Lefichach katzar HaKadosh Baruch Hu 5 shanim mishnotav. Okay? So, and for this reason, the Holy One, blessed be He, shortened by 5 years his life, the length of his life. Sheyitzchak chai kuf peshana, because Isaac lived for 180 years, v'zeh kuf ayin heshana, and Abraham lived to 175. Uvishel Yaakov adashim, and the reason why Jacob was cooking lentils, this is important, by the way, and you'll find this, if you're not aware of this, this is sort of interesting stuff with regard to Jewish tradition, because I'm sure all of you, or most of you, know that there's a traditional food that you eat at a mourner's meal, which is
Lentils.
hard-boiled eggs.
Oh.
Everybody sort of knows about the hard-boiled eggs, and there's a reason for hard-boiled eggs, which is the same as lentils. Okay, so lentils are also traditional mourner's food. Lahavrot et ha'avel, in order to console the mourner. But we're talking about the meal that you eat right after the funeral is called the havra'ah, right? And while it's translated often as meal of consolation, it comes from a word that's related, bari, meaning healing. That after you've performed the funeral, you need to start a process of healing. And having that meal is significant in terms of the healing process. Velada lama adashim. So why, he says, so he keeps breaking away and breaking down. Why dafka lentils? Shedomot lagalgal, because they look round. They look like a circle, right? Lentils are round. Shaha'avilut galgal hachozer ba'olam, because mourning, grief, is like a wheel that returns in the world. In other words, everyone is going to have to get this. At some stage or another, we're all going to have to face this. The odma, right, and he gives another additional explanation. And moreover, ma adashim ein lahem peh, just as there is no, quote, mouth, there's no opening to lentils. Kach ha'avel, so to the mourner, ein lo peh, he does not have a mouth, and you'll understand what they mean in a moment. She'asur ledaber, because he is forbidden to speak. He's not supposed to say anything. Ulefichach haminhag, and for this reason there is a custom, lahavrot et ha'avel betchilat, to give the meal, right, to feed the mourner, betchilat, at the very beginning, ma'achalo, his eating, I think is what this is meaning, or at the beginning of his meal. In other words, the first thing he has to eat, that's what he's saying. Beitzim, eggs, shehem agulim, because they're round, ve'ein lahem peh, and there's no opening. Kach avel ein lo peh. So likewise, a mourner has no mouth. And he goes to explain this. Keda'amrina b'mo'ed katan, as we explain in the tractate Mo'ed Katan, which deals with laws of mourning. Avel, with regards to the mourner, kol shlosha yamim harishonim, for the first 3 days, eino mashiv shalom lechol adam. He is not supposed to respond to anyone who greets him. He's not supposed to respond to a greeting. V'chol she'ein, and if that's true, that he doesn't respond, which is on a lower level of doing stuff, all the more so, she'eino sho'el betchila, that he doesn't inquire to begin with. He doesn't ask people how they're doing. Mishlosha va'ad zayin, but from the 3rd day on until the 7th day, mashiv, he's allowed to respond to a greeting, ve'eino sho'el, but he does not inquire, v'chule, etc. Rashi yashan, and that seems, we've had this expression before, and it may refer to manuscripts of Rashi, early manuscripts of Rashi that include this as well. So I think, people have seen eggs being served at a Shiva service, but they don't understand actually the traditional understanding as to why we do that. I haven't seen lentil soup being offered to, that I can recollect. The eggs, absolutely, hard-boiled eggs. But anyway, I think it's really cool that we were able to look into this, and that Rashi explains the significance of all of
Does
this.
the mourner can he daven
Say
at
that.
a can the mourner daven
Good, good
on his?
question. Good question. So yes, if I'm not mistaken, the mourner's allowed to lead services in the house.
Right.
Again, I'd want to be absolutely certain, but my understanding is that a mourner is allowed to, or is in fact, it's encouraged to lead the davening. But remember, he is not talking to people there. He is
So,
only addressing God.
And also he says the words and doesn't like sing the tunes like Aleinu, and doesn't
Right.
do Kaddish
That's true.
Shalem,
That's true.
or
Right.
adds, or does a slightly different.
Right. So
right.
that's yeah. There's several. Yeah, there are some different customs with regarding that Kaddish Shalem. By the way, yeah, that some do include the Titkabel and others do not. But there is a custom of in fact doing Titkabel. I would like to maybe just start to look at the Torah Tmima here, only because of the information that he gives us. Here we go. Vayavo Esav v'gomer. So Esau came. Tanya. So there is a baraita that is an early source that's contemporary with the Mishnah, but it's not in the Mishnah. Kolzman Shaya Avraham Chai, that as long as Abraham was alive, Lo Marad Esav, Esau did not rebel. Dichtiv, as it states, Vayavo Esav, as it says, Esau came. This is not a clear derivation, but anyway, Mina Sadeh v'Gomer, he came from the field, etc. V'Tanya, and there's another baraita that says, Oto hayom niftar Avraham Avinu, that on that very day Abraham, our patriarch, died. V'avar oto rasha chamesh averot, and that wicked person, referring of course to Esau, transgressed 5 different transgressions on that very day. Okay, that's in Baba Batra.
But it
So
sounds like they're saying the opposite of before. It sounded like Abraham died so he wouldn't have to see
yes,
the evil, but this
right.
is also seems to be implying that he waited to do the evil till after Abraham died.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily infer that, okay? I think it's just reinforcing the whole idea. And it's just, when it says came from the field, I'm wondering to myself, does the Sadeh in some ways imply, the field of Torah, the pasture of Torah, and that he came from it? In other words, he left it. I'm speculating. But I'm wondering, because that's what the proof text is, okay? And maybe it's not, At any rate, here's the Torah Tmima, okay? He's going to have another, this drush is also on that verse, and he goes into much more detail in this drush. But here he simply says,
I don't understand. Abraham, died because he didn't want to do the evil, but Ishmael was evil too. And
no,
Abraham had Ishmael, and and they Ishmael and Isaac were at his funeral, but
yeah.
still, no, I don't understand it.
So good point, Harlan. And the answer is that we don't see Ishmael in the same light as we see Esau. And of course,
Why?
Ishmael is not. Well, part of the reason is that when it mentions in the previous parsha Abraham's passing, it puts Isaac first. It says Isaac and Ishmael came to mourn him. And the fact that it put Isaac first is understood to mean that Ishmael did tshuva, and that he was willing to accept Isaac's predominance, and that was an indication that Ishmael did tshuva. So your question is a legitimate question, and there's an answer to it. Okay? All right. And so he says, he says, as will be explained in the next explanation. Right? Uma shekatov oto hayam niftar Avraham Avinu, and with regard to the statement that it says on that very day Abraham died, our patriarch died, mevu'ar od b'gemara, it's explained further in the Gemara, Shebishel Yaakov Tavshil Shel Adashim, that the reason why Jacob was cooking a stew of lentils or soup of lentils, Shehu Machal Avelim, and we've had this explanation in the Rashi Yashan, right? That it is the food of mourners. Mipnai Ta'amim Shonim, and here he just explains. Baruch Halevi Epstein just sort of says, on account of a number of reasons, and he says, Ien b'gemara. So it's possible that the Torah Tamima did not have that Rashi Yashan that we read. Remember that whole explanation was in parentheses. Lenachem et Yitzchak. So he was making this lentil soup to console Isaac. The Eino Mevu'ar, okay, and it's not so clear Efu meruma zeha pasuk, where this is suggested in the verse itself. V'yesh lomar, and it's possible to say, D'daikui chazal et halashon she'amar Esau, and it's possible that our sages were looking very carefully at the actual wording that Esau was using when he says Hal iteni na min ha'adom hazeh, that he was saying, give me of this red stuff. Why was he saying that? Lama lo kara et tashil hazeh bishmo ha'atzmi. In other words, why didn't he simply say to him, give me this lentil soup, right? Why didn't he say that? Why did he say this red stuff? Leimor haliteni na min ha'adashim ha'ele, to say, give me to drink or let me gulp down this from this lentil soup, or min hadazid hazeh, or from this soup. Ela ha'inyanhu, but what we can infer from this is shahaya zeh hatavshil chadash lo, that he had never seen this particular kind of food, right? He'd never seen lentil soup before. V'lo haya yodea ma tivo, and he didn't know really what it was about. He didn't necessarily know that it was lentil soup. He didn't know that it was for the sake of havra'ah. V'nit ragesh alav bichlal, and he was surprised, right? He was expressing surprise, bichlal. V'yita'aru hadom hazeh. He was so surprised to see this, he described it as this red stuff, right? This V'darshu chazal, and our sages interpreted ma ze haita hasiba. They then from that inferred as to what was the reason shebishel Yaakov nazid chadash, that why was it that Jacob was cooking a whole new kind of stew, shelo hayu regilim umakirim, that they weren't used to seeing. In other words, this was the first time that this was being offered up as mourners' food. Okay, and because of the various reasons that we explained, v'samchu shezeh haya tavshil miyuchad lenichum avilim, and they explained that this was a unique food, a unique dish to comfort mourners. Mipnei shebe'oto hayam niftar Avraham Avinu, because on that very day Abraham had passed away. As is explained. And we'll stop here and we'll take a look further on for this as regards this particular whole issue. You can see how easy it is to go into greater depth regards to these verses.
So this section fits in between. This little section would fit in between like the Torah, the end of Abraham's life.
Yes, absolutely.
You almost want to read it there because then you get the whole Ishmael's line and stuff, and it breaks up everything if you read it straight through. Right.
Well, the Torah narrative isn't necessarily in chronological order.
I know that, but I mean, for somebody who was going to read the story, it would be almost better to have like an arrow pointing to Toldot before you finish off Abraham's story.
Yes. You could.
And then it would make more sense.
Maybe so. Maybe so. I don't know.
Would see the death of Abraham. You would see the 175 years. You have to do the math to make it work otherwise.
Right. But there are other reasons as to why the Torah chooses this particular style. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording and thank those who have joined us to do this, and hope you've enjoyed.